Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf. It's primarily about when wild animals are considered muktzah on Yom Tov. We know that on Yom Tov you're allowed to slaughter an animal in order to eat it. However, if it wasn't yours and it wasn't set aside to be eaten at the beginning of Yom Tov, it is muktzah at that time because it wasn't food. So what stage and what do you have to do to make it not considered muktzah? Is it enough that you're intending to eat it? Do you have to have access to it? Do you have to actually do something to show that you're planning on slaughtering it and eating it over Yom Tov? How do you make it not muktzah any longer? But halfway through the daf, we'll have a Mishnah which will teach us the topic of slaughtering an animal which is intended to be slaughtered, not really because you want to eat it, just because you don't want it to die on its own, and then it'll be non-kosher and you'll have a loss of money. The Gemara will take us into other topics related to that Mishnah, and then some Agarata about Klal Yisrael in general. Let's begin the daf. The Gemara says that if somebody has a canal of water and he stops it up so that fish cannot get in and out before Yom Tov, then he gets up in the morning on Yom Tov and he finds that there are fish in there. That means that the fish must have been there the entire time. They must have been there at the beginning of Yom Tov because it couldn't get in on Yom Tov. So those fish were they were set aside before Yom Tov to be eaten, to be fished out, because they were already trapped in his enclosed canal. So the halacha there in that situation, says Rav, is that it's mutter. You don't consider those muktzah. They were set aside before Yom Tov. So now there are three Talmidim of Rav that comment on this. You have Rabba bar Rav Huna, you have Rav Chizda and Rav Nachman. All three of them discuss this. And one of them wanted to learn a halacha out of it, and there's two versions of this. Was it Rav Chizda or was it Rabba, who was the son of Rav Huna? Rav Huna was the Talmud of Rav. It was Rav Chizda, Rav Huna, and Rav Nachman, and Rabba was the son of one of the Talmidim. So, according to one version, it's Rav Chizda who commented, and the others asked on him, and they said, it looks like our friend Rav Chizda has gotten himself into hot water because he's entered a big machlokes. According to the other one, there was Rabbah, and the comment was, it looks like our friend's son has gotten himself into hot water. But what he wanted to learn from this was that if you have a wild animal that enters your orchard, your fenced orchard, which is closed in, and then it gives birth on Yom Tov, so that animal that's born there is permitted, it's not considered muktzah, because it cannot escape on its own. It's too young to run away from within the confines of the orchard. And it's easy for you to catch, and therefore it's very easy for you to get, and therefore it's not considered muktzah at all. So that's what he says based on this. And he says that you can learn this halacha out of Rav. So the Gemara says does not appear to be correct. That halacha is very different, because there you didn't do any action to show that you intend on eating it. It just was born there. You have to do something to make it non-muktzah. Just the fact that it was born in a situation where you could easily reach it is not enough. That's problem number one. And problem number two is that there's a Beitzah that clearly shows that in that case, it is muktzah. The more quotes the Beitzah at length, while an animal, says the Beitzah, which set up its living quarters inside your orchard, you have to do something to make it mizumin, to make it prepared to be eaten. Now that clearly shows that this halacha is wrong, but we'll quote the Beitzah here in full. The Beitzah goes further and says that a bird which is accustomed to being in the house, and therefore it's hard to catch because it can hide in the corners, you have to tie its wings together before Yom Tov to show that you plan on eating it. You also need to do that because you also have to differentiate it from its mother. This is a bird called a duror bird. It's very small, and therefore when it's first born, it's about the same size as its mother. The mother itself is a small bird. You might easily confuse the two. So you have to do something to show that you plan on eating the baby bird if you want to eat that one, and you have to tie its wings together. And this comes from these halachas were testified to by Shmai and Avitalian. So again, you see clearly that the halacha about the wild animal that gave birth in your orchard is wrong. So now the Gemara has a Beitzah that says the other way. The Gemara has a Beitzah that shows that you do not have to do something for an animal which is born in your orchard in order to show that you plan on eating it. And the Gemara quotes this Beitzah. It's rather long. So the Gemara says, Rav Shimon ben Elazar says that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that if you had a pigeon coop full of birds, and this is a lengthy Beitzah which we've seen earlier in the Masechta, with all kinds of cases where you set aside one to be shechted on Yom Tov, and then when you came back, it wasn't quite in the exact same spot. There were two coops, and you found the one that you left wasn't quite where you left it. It was on the porch in front of the coop, and it could be from the other coop, and therefore it may not be the one that you left it there. So if it's in a situation like that, both Beis Hillel and Mesham agree that it's usher, because you don't know if it's the same one. That's if it's Yonei Shovach, if it's the birds from a coop or the birds from an attic, or other types of birds which nested in your jars or in a creation that you made, a building that you set up. All those cases you have to assume that they're a muktzah. But if you have goose or chickens or hardasiot pigeons, or, and this is our point, or a wild animal which gave birth in your orchard, all these cases are permitted, and you don't have to do anything to prepare it. So there we see the line clearly that you don't have to do anything to prepare it. Now this brisa continues. It says a duror bird, you have to tie its wings, like we said before, in order that you don't confuse it with its mother. A tied up bird and a bird that you handled in your house or in other houses or in pits or wells or things like that, those are all permitted. If they're in the trees, they're forbidden because you can't climb trees to get to them because you may break off a branch of the tree. If they're tied up or if they are handled, so you could tell that they were handled previously anywhere else, then it's usher even during the week for you to take because somebody else tied them up and handled them, and therefore they're his. He was koning them. He acquired them through the tying or the handling. So again, this is a long brisa, but the point is that we clearly see here that an animal which gave birth in your yard, you do not have to do anything to make it not muktzah. So you have a contradiction between this and the previous brisa about Shmai and Avatayim. So the Gemara says, not a kasha, one is talking about the mother animal, and one is talking about the baby. So the Gemara says the mother and the baby, you have to, it's not enough to just do zimun, to prepare to do some action to the mother. The mother is, you have to really hunt it down. It could really run away. It's not enough to just say, oh, I'm preparing this one. So therefore, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak gives a different answer, and he says there's two types of yards. One is where the yard is near the city, and one is where the yard is far from the city. If it's near you, then you intend to go and get it and hunt it down, and you're not going to do an actual trapping, but you intend to eat it. If it's far away, then you do not intend to eat it, and that's why you have to do some ma'isa to be mizamin. But we're both talking about the kid, we're not talking about the mother. Okay, this concludes this Gemara. Now we get to our next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses the halacha of a misukenes. Misukenes is an animal which is about to die. If it will die, it becomes nevela and it's forbidden for you to eat. So in order to save it from becoming asur to eat, losing the entire value of the animal, you want to hurry up and shacht it right away. Now, if you're planning on eating it on Yom Tov, it's not a problem, because even though you're only shachting it in order to save yourself from a monetary loss, you're also going to eat it on Yom Tov. So it is a shechita, that's l'tzorech, for needs of food on Yom Tov. However, what if you already ate your meal and the Yom Tov is almost over, and you're not going to actually get a chance to eat it? So then you would not be allowed to shacht it, because this is a shechita, which is a malacha, and it's not for food purposes. So it's got to be that you have enough time to at least eat a kezayis from it, and the fastest way to do that would be to roast it, so you just would cut off a kezayis and roast it. If you have enough time to do that before Yom Tov is over, then you could still shacht it. Now, Rabbi Kiva says you don't have to have that much time. Even if the most you could do is cut off a kezayis of flesh from the neck where you slaughtered it, well, the phrase he uses is the veis tvichasa, the house of cutting up, which we assume means the neck where he slaughtered. If you could just cut off a piece of flesh there, which means you won't skin the animal first, you'll just cut off a piece of flesh, and you'll eat it raw, you won't even have time to roast it. If that's all the time you have left, that's also enough to allow you to be able to slaughter this animal now. Now, if it was out in the field, you had to slaughter it out in the field, you cannot carry it into your house, you cannot bring it in from the field. That's a zilzal yontif, it's a disgrace to the yontif to do dragging around like that, and it looks the same way you do slaughtering during the weekday, so you shouldn't do that. You can bring it in on a stick or on a litter. The only thing you could do is cut it up into pieces and bring it in piece by piece. Okay, now the Gemara goes into a totally different sugya, and it's going to want to try to prove something about that sugya from the statement of Rabbi Kiva that you're allowed to cut off a kezayis from the slaughtering area and eat it. So the quote is from Rami Bar Abba, who says that we notice that the Torah tells us that when you bring a carbon olah, you're supposed to skin it and cut it up into pieces before you burn it on the mizbeach. So we learn from there that even somebody who's just making regular meat, a butcher, should skin it and cut it up before serving it to be eaten. You shouldn't eat a piece of an animal before it's properly skinned and cut up. So the Gemara wants to understand why. Why should I first skin and cut up the animal before I eat the meat? So the Gemara first thinks maybe there's an isser involved. What would be the isser? Well, if you don't have a chance to skin it and cut it up, you won't have a chance to check for treifas. You won't have a chance to see if the animal has an injury or a wound, which makes it not kosher. So perhaps he's coming to tell me that you have to first check for treif signs, and only then can you eat it. That would mean that we're saying that you cannot assume that an animal is kosher until you check it for signs of treifa. That would be against the statement of Rav Huna. Rav Huna says that as long as an animal is alive, it's usher to eat, and it stays usher to eat. It's becheskas isser until you've proven conclusively that it was shechted properly. And once it's shechted, it's assumed to be kosher. You don't have to worry about treifas until some suffix, some reason to suspect there might be a treif situation develops. But until you've actually seen any evidence of treif, you could assume that it's kosher even if you didn't check for anything. So Gemara says, so that would be, so maybe what Rami Bar Abba is coming to tell me is against this Rav Huna. Rav Huna is saying you could assume it's kosher even if you've never checked for treif until you find some indication that something's wrong. And Rami Bar Abba is saying, no, you have to check first, and therefore you shouldn't eat it before you've cut it up and skinned it. So Gemara says, that would make sense. The problem is that Rabbi Akiva here in this Mishnah says that you could just cut a piece from the neck area, and you didn't skin it, and you didn't cut it up. So if that was usher to do, how could Rabbi Akiva say that you're allowed to do that? So Gemara says maybe when he said the Veis Tvichasa, the house of cutting, he didn't mean the place where it was slaughtered in the neck. Maybe he just meant inside the internals, where the stomach grinds up the food. Maybe that's what he meant. Someone says that can't be, because Rabbi Chia explains this Mishnah in a Beitzah that he says, and he says clearly that it means the place where it's slaughtered. So it can't be what it means. So the Gemara says, so therefore Rami Bar Abba was talking about something else. He wasn't telling me a halacha that it's usher to cut because of concerns of treif. He was telling me that it's not the derech eretz, it's not proper manners to rush to eat an animal so quickly before you even skinned it and cut it up. That is the appearance of being ravenous. That's like being a slob. What you should do, instead of being a glutton, is you should go slowly. Now, similar to that, we see another few halachos in a Beitzah that says you should not eat an onion or a garlic from its head. You should eat it from the end where the leaves grow. Otherwise, it looks like you're too gluttonous. Also, you should not drink an entire cup, have a cup of wine in one gulp, one swallow. That's gluttony. And there's another Beitzah that says you shouldn't drink it in 3 gulps because that's being too picky. The right thing to do is in 2 gulps. 2 swallows is how much a cup should take you. The Gemara says, further on the subject, the Gemara says that Rami Bar Abba says another thing. He says there's a plant called chatzuva. Chatzuva is grasses that grow straight down. Their roots don't spread out to the side. It's a good grass to use to mark a border. As a matter of fact, Yeshua used that to mark the borders. So those grasses cause problems for wicked people who steal other people's land. Those grasses will show that they stole the land and that's not really where the border was. Another thing he said, the halachos of Orla, that you have to wait 3 years before you could eat the fruits, that's hard for people who are in a rush. People who eat the animal before waiting until it's skinned and cut up. It's also hard for the people who are together with their wives while they're in Nida. They don't have the patience to wait until she goes to the mikvah. These are people who are all in a rush. They'll have a hard time with the halacha of Orla. And another thing he said is that a turmus is a plant. It's a bean, a flat, round bean, around the size of a coin. That is bad for Soneim Shal Yisrael, the enemies of Israel, which is a euphemistic reference to Klal Yisrael. How is this bean bad for Klal Yisrael? So Rashi explains the bean has to be cooked 7 times before you can eat it. The taste is very strong and bitter. Cook it 7 times, it becomes sweet enough to eat. So Klal Yisrael didn't have that Maila even. Klal Yisrael was not even as good as that. How so? So the Gemara brings a pasuk in Shoftim, which says, "Vayisifu b'nei Yisrael lasas rabbi b'nei Hashem." Klal Klal Yisrael continued doing bad in the eyes of Hashem. Vayavu es habaylim, they served the Baal idol. Vesa Ashtaros, Vesa Elokei Aram, Vesa Elokei Tzidon, Vesa Elokei Moav, Vesa Elokei Bnei Ammon, Vesa Elokei Pelishtim. 7 different types of idols they served. Then it says Vayazu es Hashem, and they abandoned Hashem, v'lo avduh, and they did not serve Him. So the Gemara says, what's this repeated language? They abandoned Hashem and then did not serve Him. That's repeating the same thing twice. What it means to say is that after they served 7 other ones, they didn't even serve Hashem, even after serving 7 other ones. Meaning to say they're not even as good as the tormus bean. The tormus bean, once you cook it 7 times, it's already sweet enough that you could eat it then. But we rejected Hashem 7 times, and we still didn't serve Him afterwards, and therefore that is a condemnation against Klal Yisrael. Now the Gemara speaks more about Klal Yisrael. The Gemara says that Rav Meir says that why was Torah given to Klal Yisrael? Because they are azin, they're bold, or they have chutzpah in a sense. What does that mean? So Rabbi Shmuel says, like the Torah says, mi no eish das lamo. What's eish das? The fire of the law. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says these people should have a fiery nature to them. They have a fiery nature to them. Therefore, I'm going to give them the Torah that will calm that nature down. As Rashi explains, Torah takes a lot of energy out of you. It requires a great investment. So it'll cool off the urgent and the fiery nature of Klal Yisrael. There are some that have a different version of this, that Klal Yisrael has a nature themselves which is so fiery that if not for the fact that they were given Torah, there is no nation in the world that would be able to stand up to them. And therefore Torah was given to them that they should be equal, and that the other nations of the world should be able to deal with them. And Rish Lakish says that there are 3 Az things out there. Yisrael is the most Az, the most the boldest of the nations. The dog is the same amongst animals. Chicken is that way amongst the birds, and some even go further and say the goat is that personality amongst thin farm animals, and some say that the tzlaf plant, the caperberry plant, is like that amongst trees. Okay, that concludes this Gemara's discussion. Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah, where it says you should not bring the animal in from the field after you've slaughtered it on a stick. Gemara quotes a Beitzah that says a blind man should not carry his walking stick in the street on Yom Tov, and a shepherd should not carry his backpack. The reason for these 2 things is that it's a zilzol Yom Tov. Now, this is obviously not the walking stick that the blind man needs to be able to get around, because that he has a right to carry in the street even on Shabbos. But he shouldn't carry that around, his regular stick, and the shepherd shouldn't carry the backpack, because these are weekday things. You shouldn't carry that around at all. The Gemara goes further, and the Gemara says this kind of chair that you use to carry people around from place to place, either a man or a woman, you shouldn't carry those. You shouldn't carry anybody in those on Yom Tov either. It's also a zilzul. It's also not respectful to the Yom Tov. The Gemara says, is that true? Rav Yaakov bar Idi once sent and carried an old man in his neighborhood from one place to another in this chair. And they asked Yeshua ben Levi, are you allowed to do that? And he said, if the tzibor, if the congregation needs him to be able to give a shir or something, then you're allowed to. And the Gemara says that in a similar vein, there was a Talmid Chacham named Achi Shtakya who said, I carried Rav Huna from a place called Hini to Shili, from Shili to Hini. Nachman bar Yitzchak said, I carried Shmuel from the sun to the shade, and from the shade to the sun, in a similar way. And over there, the reason again was because the public needed him. Now, Rav Nachman said to Chama bar Ada on your way to Eretz Yisrael, because he traveled often to Eretz Yisrael, when he passed by Tzidon, so go out of your way a little and go up the mountain there and visit Rav Yaakov bar Idi and ask him, are you allowed to carry people in this chair in this way? So he went there and he found that he had already passed away. Rav Yaakov bar Idi was no longer alive, couldn't ask him. Instead, he went to Rizrika and he asked him, what do you say about this chair? You're allowed to carry people in that? So he said, yeah, you're allowed to, as long as you don't carry it on your shoulder. What does carry on your shoulder mean? So it's something called alunki. Rashi explains that they had two people who locked arms. One put his arm on the other one's shoulder, and vice versa, and they carried people like that. So you can't do that. That's the kind of thing that the zilzal yontif, but other types of chair carrying you are allowed to do. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman did that for Yalta, for his wife. So the Gemara says that was different because she was afraid of falling. The Gemara says that a Meimer and Marzutra used to do that on the Shabbos, which is Yom Tov. So the Gemara says that's because there were big crowds and they were afraid they would get knocked off the chair, and that's why they did that in a special way. But otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to use that procedure.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.